Okay, students, unfortunately, the Zoom meeting did not get recorded as we had hoped, and so it's not going to be posted. And so instead, I'm posting this recap, and my apologies that it's not a particularly lovely set of slides. Under the time constraints, I didn't have a lot of time to make it more interesting looking and find pictures and all that good stuff. But we did ask 3 questions, and I'm going to go through those questions in this presentation. So the first question that you were to be looking at was to name 3 defects in the Articles of Confederation, and then did the Constitution solve them? And I've listed on this slide more than 3 defects. There, you could have chosen any of these. The inability to regulate trade and the inability to stop states from printing money and be the only ones that printed money, the inability to tax, were all problems causing a weak federal government. And then the others here are problems with the setup itself. Even if it was a strong government, it would have problems because under the Articles of Confederation, there was only the one branch of government, the Congress, and so there wasn't any executive and there was no specific judiciary. It was very hard to pass a law. You had to have 9 out of 13 states. Each state got 1 vote. And given that there were 5 states whose total population was smaller than the population of Virginia, you could very easily have a situation where a very small minority was of the total population was holding up things that the majority of the population wanted to have. That part is not entirely fixed by the Constitution because we still have a situation where the smaller rural states are overrepresented in the Senate compared to the more populous states. And it was practically impossible to amend the Articles of Confederation. You had to have all 13 states vote for it in Congress, and then you also had to have all of their legislatures approve the amendments. So those were the problems, and by and large they were in fact solved by the Constitution, with the possible exception of the complaint that that it was pretty hard to pass a law, and that you could have a minority holding up a law that the majority wanted. Okay, did the Constitution solve the problem of factions, as Madison argued that it would in Federalist 10? And let's take a moment to talk about what Madison's argument actually was in Federalist 10, because it's 1790s language, has words like opprobrium and desiderium and things like that in it, and it's kind of hard for students to follow. So basically what he said was that factions are a part of human nature. If you're going to have government by the people, then people are going to disagree on how things should be done, and they're going to divide up into we want it this way and they want it that way, which are factions. He said that Republican governments reduce faction compared to a straight democracy. If everybody gets a vote, it essentially becomes mob rule in straight democracy. In a Republican government where you are selecting people to represent you, you theoretically will choose level-headed people who will put the good of the whole above their own good, and therefore be less susceptible to join factions. But even so, you he argued, you will have factions developing if we just leave each state to have its own Republican government, and we're essentially a coalition of 13 independent states. But if you had a national Republican government, he said, you would have less problem with factions because you would still have the same benefit of Republican government over pure democracy, and because you are over such a bigger area, it would be less likely that a faction could develop. Because, for example, how often would it be that the interests of, say, South Carolina, New Jersey, and Connecticut would line up with each other? And so he said, if we have the larger republic, factions will be less of a problem. Now, you can make an argument that perhaps he was right, and we have less problems with factions than we would have had we not had the Constitution. If you look at the various state governments and see how many of them are essentially one-party control, and the party holds sway over everything and essentially keeps the other party from ever getting any of their ideas passed, versus the national government and how often that happens, you could make an argument that perhaps the problem of factions was solved. But in general, I would say my argument is no, it was not solved. We are on the verge of a presidential election, and it is an extremely divisive question in America. We have people on both sides who are very upset with the people on the other side, and essentially divided into factions. So, all right, let's go to Mason's objections. So the third question that you were to look at was, did the Bill of Rights solve Mason's objections to the Constitution? And so I'm just going to go through all 16 of Mason's objections real quick and discuss whether they were solved or not. And his first objection was that there was no Declaration of Rights, and the Bill of Rights is a declaration, so that was solved. His second objection was that the House isn't really representative, and the Bill of Rights didn't change anything about how the House is formed, and so that was not solved. Third objection, that the Senate could alter bills about money. Remember that the House has to initiate bills that have anything to do with money. The idea being that the House is closer to the people, and so they should control things that have to do with money, taxation, etc. But since the Senate has to pass the same bill that the House initiates, and the Senate can do their version of it, and then it goes back to the House, and the House and Senate both vote on the same thing again, the Senate can still alter bills about money, so that was not solved. His objection number 4, that the Senate could usurp the powers of the states, was solved by the 9th and 10th Amendments. His objection number 5, that the United States judiciary would be able to overrule the judiciaries of the individual states, is generally speaking solved by the 10th Amendment, but not entirely, because the Supreme Court can declare things unconstitutional. Having said that, it was solved at the time, because until the 14th Amendment came in, the first 10 amendments did not apply to the states. Objection 6, the president has no council of state. That was not solved. Mason objected, saying that the president would end up, since there is no council of state, he would end up relying on the people that he appointed to the various positions of different departments, and that's exactly what happened. The president now has cabinet meetings, and whoever he has appointed to be the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Agriculture, etc., are his counselors. Objection 7, the Vice President is the President of the Senate. That's not been solved, but it turned out not to be a big deal. Mason was concerned that the Vice President, being the President of the Senate, would give the executive, that is the President, undue power over the Senate, and also that whatever state the Vice President was from would have excess power in the Senate. And from the very beginning, with John Adams as the first Vice President and first President of the Senate, the senators ignored the Vice President. And today, I think very few people would argue that Vice President Pence gives Indiana any advantage in the Senate, nor, for that matter, that he gives President Trump an advantage with the Senate. They basically just ignore the Vice President. The only thing that the Vice President ever does as President of the Senate is break a tie vote, and that doesn't happen very often. Objection 8, the President could use his pardon power to hide his own guilt. If the President turned out to be a criminal, he could pardon his co-conspirators, and they would basically get him off. And that isn't addressed in the Bill of Rights, so that one was not solved. He objected to the fact that the treaties did not include the House. They could be negotiated by the executive and the Senate would approve them, and then they became the supreme law of the land, even though the House didn't get a chance to vote on them. That wasn't solved. Objection number 10, he said a simple majority to make laws on commerce meant that the northern states could gang up on the southern states, and that was not solved by the Bill of Rights. He said that Congress could grant monopolies and pass laws that inflicted cruel and unusual punishment, and that was essentially solved by the 8th Amendment in the case of the cruel and unusual punishment, but by the entirety of the Bill of Rights. Objection number 12 complained about no freedom of the press, trial by jury, etc., and that was solved. All of those things that he objected to there are in the first 10 amendments. He objected that states, for number 13, he objected that states can't pass export duties. So he was a Virginian, and Virginia could not pass a export duty that said you have to pay money if you're going to take tobacco out of Virginia into Maryland or into New York, etc., which was a way that states could raise money instead of taxing in other ways, and that was not solved. He objected that no ex post facto laws would not be respected. In other words, the Constitution said there won't be any ex post facto laws, and Mason said all legislatures pass ex post facto laws, and that was not solved, but it turned out he was wrong, because ex post facto prohibition has been respected for 200 years plus now. He said it makes a moderate aristocracy, and he didn't really get very specific about that, but it certainly was not solved by those 10 amendments. You can argue whether he was correct on that one or not. Aristocracies are, in general, where a group of people are in charge and then their children are in charge after them. If we look at our history, we do see that George H.W. Bush was president, and then his son George W. Bush was president recently. We see that President John F. Kennedy's family was and still is routinely elected in Massachusetts. Mitt Romney's dad was a governor, and then Mitt Romney grew up to be a governor and a senator. So we do have some political dynasties, but I would argue they're not really an aristocracy. So I think he was wrong in that objection. And finally, his objection that you can't stop the importation of slaves for 20 years was not solved. That was a feature of the Constitution that Mason objected to because he said importing slaves is weakening the United States because internationally people don't think importing slaves is a good thing, and we're going to continue to do it for at least 20 years. And that's bad news. Now, I might note that in the state of Virginia, which was a slave state, they had the ability actually to export slaves. So in Virginia, the slave population was reproducing at a high enough rate that Virginia could continue to enjoy its slave labor without having to worry about importing new slaves, and Georgia and South Carolina could not. So one could make the argument that Mason was being a little disingenuous here and was trying to set it up so that his state of Virginia would essentially have a monopoly on new slaves for South Carolina and Georgia, and that he wasn't really all that worried about how horrible importing slaves were. But I will not try to say one way or the other whether that was his actual thinking, because I can't get into his head. All right, hopefully that helps. You have the guided notes to fill out, and make sure that you do that and get them turned in. And thanks for listening.